Good evening, everyone. Welcome to SWATH 2025, Freedom at Your Fingertips, Black Texas History in the Digital Age. This is part 2 of a 5-part virtual workshop. I'm pleased this evening that we have Dr. Tomiko Meeks. Dr. Meeks she participated in the very first SWATH in 2014. SWATH stands for Summer Workshop on African American Texas History. At the time, after she presented and participated in SWATH, she became an adjunct professor of history at Texas Southern, and now she is Dr. Tomiko Meeks. So I'm really proud that she is here with us. I'm going to read her bio. Dr. Tomiko Meeks is a historian, educator, and cultural consultant whose scholarship focuses on 19th century African American, Black girlhood, and resistance studies. She earned her BA in psychology and MA in history from the University of Houston, followed by her PhD in history from Howard University. Her dissertation, Silent Resistance, Enslaved Girls, Poison, and the Politics of Survival, 1820 to 1860, examines the covert strategies employed by enslaved girls to resist bondage through poison, shedding light on overlooked aspects of agency and survival. Dr. Meeks is currently a visiting professor at Texas Southern University. Her mission is to inspire and mentor students in the field of history. She serves as the vice president of the Texas Oral History Association and corresponding secretary for the Bay Area Houston alumni chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Her scholarly interests encompass oral history, public memory, and digital humanities. She has contributed to significant projects with the University of Houston and the Menil Collection on the effects of the Atlantic slave trade on the visual culture of Africa. Additionally, she serves as co-chair of the Digital Humanities Symposium at Houston Community College and participates annually in the HBCU Oral History Project on Race and Reconciliation. An active member of the scholarly community, Dr. Meeks is affiliated with the Association for the Study of African American Life and History and Howard University Social Justice Consortium. Her commitment to education and social justice is further exemplified by her membership in Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. She serves as the corresponding secretary for the Bay Area Houston alumni chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Welcome to Dr. Tomiko Meeks.
Thank you, Dr. Kossie-Chernyshev. And I want to, again, thank you for inviting me to participate with SWATH. It's always very insightful to participate with SWATH and hear all of the speakers. Glad to be another speaker this year. And I want to say good evening to everyone and thank you for being here. As Dr. Kossie has already said, my name is Dr. Tomiko Meeks, and I want to have a conversation today about the work of memory, specifically the work of recovering the lives, voices, and resistance methods of enslaved Black girls who are so often silenced in traditional historical narratives. And this talk tonight grows out of my dissertation, which is titled Silent Resistance, Enslaved Girls, Poison, and the Politics of Survival, 1820 to 1860, which examines how enslaved girls use poison as a covert weapon to protect themselves against the physical, sexual, and emotional violence of slavery. But in order for me to adequately tell their stories, I had to confront a monumental challenge. and that was the archives. Because the archives rarely speak in favor of Black girls and Black women. Their presence is often fragmentary, embedded in legal trials, medical records, newspaper reports, runaway slave ads, plantation ledgers, and diaries. And almost always, their presence is mediated by the voice of their white oppressors. And so the question that I pose to you today, and I will pose several, but the first one is this: how do we create an archival methodology that not only finds these girls, but listens to them, honors them, and restores their personhood? Now, you may be wondering why this work matters. It matters because enslaved Black girls are underrepresented in the archives. And their resistance often goes unrecognized or misattributed, meaning that there was something else going on. For instance, arsenic. Arsenic was prevalent in the 19th century. It was literally in everything. It was in paint, it was in wallpaper, makeup, um, just everywhere. And so a lot of times it wasn't that enslaved Black girls and women were intentionally poisoning their owners. Sometimes owners poisoned themselves, and that poisoning was misattributed to enslaved girls and enslaved females. And this work is also important because we need to look at archival methodologies, and the way that we look at them needs to shift to include the silence that we see there and the absence of enslaved Black girls. And so my work, it seeks to fill a critical gap in the historical record, and it's about connecting to restorative justice and social justice. So I want to begin by addressing the limitations of the traditional archive. Mainstream archives in the United States, whether it's at the state level, it's in a university special collections, or in digital repositories, have historically privileged the voices of literate white male elites. And these institutions preserve the records of power. This is something that I talk about in my dissertation, Public and Private Transcripts. This is a theory brought forward by anthropologist James C. Scott. And those records of power are embedded in laws, estate inventories, court decision, plantation ledgers, correspondence between enslavers, but within them, enslaved girls often appear only as unnamed laborers, objects of sale, or sources of trouble. For instance, in the State versus Ann, 1850, this is a case out of Mississippi. One of the cases that I looked at doing my research for my dissertation, Anne was a teenage enslaved girl. This is something that I surmised because there was no record of her age that was listed, but she was tried for allegedly poisoning her enslaver's family. The court record identified her only as the girl Anne, meaning then that she was a possession. Like I said before, there was no age that was listed, no family connection, no words were heard from her. Yet her actions told a story of resistance. And so, in reading these records, I had to resist the archive's own violent nature, the way that it erases identity, humanity, and even context. And so, to recover Anne's story, I had to start asking different questions. Questions such as, what does it mean that poison was her weapon of choice? And what conditions would lead a girl to that decision of using poison? And how might her silence whether it was intentional or not, itself be a form of a strategy. So, to address these silences, I used what I call archival methodology of refusal and reclamation. Now, this is a methodology where refusal is about rejecting this notion that enslaved girls are voiceless, simply because their words are not recorded. It means resisting the archive's demand for corroboration, for literacy, or adult personhood as prerequisites for historical validity. And reclamation, meanwhile, involves a type of rereading the archive against the grain, where you reassemble the fragments in ways that center the enslaved girl's interiority, her internal character, and her agency. And so this methodology draws inspiration from scholars like Sadia Hartman, Marissa Fuentes, and James C. Scott, who Marissa Fuentes and Sadia Hartman advocate for what they call critical fabulation and archival redress, which then supposes, right, this type of Black feminism where I was able to speculate about what was going on in the lives of enslaved girls. And I use these strategies to shift the archive from a site of extraction to a site of ethical interpretation. And one of the cases that I will present to you is the case of Maria, an enslaved girl. She was in Delaware, 1827. And Maria, um, her weapon of choice was arson. The family that purchased her from her previous owner, um, they were named the Prettymans. And the Prettymans, like literally the night that Maria is with them, she sets their house on fire. And the owner, Mr. Prettyman, he wakes up, the family is asleep. He wakes up and he catches the fire before it spreads all over the whole entire house. And later, what I uncovered, because I'm sure you're asking, well, why are we talking about arson when you wrote about poison? As I was digging through these records and trying to figure out what was going on with Maria, what I found out was that she ultimately um, had tried to poison her previous owner. And so this story was important for me, and I included it in my dissertation, but there were very limited sources. There was this brief court summary and a local newspaper clip, but the way that I was able to sort of recreate Maria's life is that I used surrounding data, right? I had her age. I looked at Delaware's slave demographics and records of similar accounts, both of arson and poisoning. And I reconstructed this broader picture of her world, one where young girls protected themselves against abuse using domestic knowledge of fire, poison, and other acts of subversion. And so, what did I do with these fragments, right? Well, I had to learn to read them differently and to recognize not just what was written, but what was withheld, right? Because again, I started with this petition. And in this particular petition, what Prettyman was doing, and he was a local politician, and I looked at some of the other cases that he was involved in. He was very much concerned about enslaved people as well as free Blacks being able to live in Delaware with whites. And what he did with Maria in this particular petition was that he was asking that the court export. that send Maria out of Delaware because she proved, at least in his mind, to be a threat to his family. And one of the things that, and the way that I found out that her former owner was selling her because she tried to poison them, is this last little statement, right, where Prettyman is telling the court basically that if the previous owner had notified him in advance, he would have never purchased Maria because she had attempted to poison the previous owner. And so that sort of highlighted, right, this fear and anxiety that white slaveholders had around the prospect of enslaved people poisoning them. And so again, that prompted me in many ways to read these archives differently. And so something else that I started to understand is that the archive is a structure that's shaped by violence and absence, and that these absences are historically meaningful. We cannot ignore them because they tell us about the strategies that girls use to protect themselves. They tell us about the dangers that these girls face when they disrupted white power, and about the selective memory of a system that recorded Black girlhood only when Black girls posed a threat. This was foundational, and it challenged my work, right? Where I was trying to turn the archive from a site of extraction into a site of ethical interpretation, to treat even the smallest trace, like a name in a court transcript or a line in a newspaper, not as an endpoint, but as an entry point into larger questions, such as what did survival and protection look like for enslaved girls? What forms did resistance take? And how then could I tell their stories without reproducing the violence that erased them initially? I would say perhaps one of the most haunting cases that I have in my dissertation is that of Charity. Charity was a young girl between the ages of 10 and 12. It wasn't clear in the historical record her exact age, but she was enslaved in Louisville, Kentucky, right in the center of downtown. She didn't live on a huge plantation out in the country. And what she did took place in 1858. And she was accused of poisoning the Pope family, who were her enslavers. Now, unlike Maria's case, Charity's case got a lot of attention. Her The poisoning incident was reported widely across Louisville newspapers and across Kentucky, and doctors covered it because one of the doctors that was called to the scene reported that they had found arsenic traces in the coffee and in the food. And Charity was immediately, right, accused of poisoning. But there was no record of her defense that I could find. So there was no extant record of her defense. But she was arrested. That was made clear in the newspaper articles. She had ran and she was trying to get out of Louisville, and the police catch up with her. She confessed. She was tried, and according to some accounts, and I could not fully verify this, she was most likely executed because that was the punishment, regardless of your age. If you poisoned a white person in Kentucky, you would have been executed. And so, what Charity's story underscores is the fear, right? The fear that surrounded whites and Black girls and Black women who had access to their homes, because Charity worked in the kitchen. She prepared their meals. She handled everything. And she moved through these private spaces. There was no record of any other adult enslaved woman who lived in the home with her. And the archival record positioned the Pope family then as extremely fearful of Charity. Again, Charity was no older than 12 years old, right? But the family that enslaved her, they were very fearful of her. And this is because of this intimacy, right, that she had with the family. There was this fear of betrayal and fear of knowledge of medicinal plants and herbs and chemicals that they could not control. And so it was in that fear that we sort of can see, right, the logic of the archive, where it records Black girls only when they pose a threat to the boundaries of white order. And so, what do these cases tell us? What did they tell me? First, they told me that enslaved girls were only seen when they broke the rules. The archive is not neutral, right? The archive is shaped by surveillance, suspicion, and punishment. Second, it showed me that resistance often left only the faintest of traces because there was an accusation, there may have been a name, a charge, right? And that was basically it. And third, that silence in the archive is not the same as silence in life. These girls may not have been recorded speaking, but they acted. That shows that they weren't silent. They made choices. And these choices, although they were dangerous, it showed that they were desperate. You have to be desperate, right, to poison someone. They were also courageous. And all of those choices, we have to read them with care. And so my work, what I did not do was treat these records that I came across as complete truths. I treated them as fragments of a violent system, but within them, I started to look for possibilities for what Saidiya Hartman calls critical fabulation. Critical fabulation is a method of reimagining the lives of the disappeared. I asked questions such as, what does it mean that poison was used repeatedly by young girls in domestic spaces? What did it mean that so many of them are voiceless in legal records, but present in patterns of resistance? What can we learn from the archive for what the archive tries to suppress? And so reading these stories against the grain, and this is something that I hope that you as the listening audience will also try to do. My hope was that I was reclaiming something that the archive refused to give over, right? Black girlhood as a site of thought, as a site of will and survival. The very fact that they were feared, then punished, and remembered only in times of crisis is evidence of their agency. And so the archive, although it rendered them visible only in punishment, it was my task to make them visible and give them personhood. Now, I had to try to build an archive because, again, I'm looking at pieces. I didn't have anyone's full entire story. And so to build an archive that centers enslaved girls and enslaved women, I had to at first expand my idea of what counts as a historical record. And I had to move beyond the idea that only formal, state sanctioned, or fully legible texts were worthy of my historical inquiry. Instead, I looked toward the margins. I looked at things that were overlooked. I pulled the fragments, the emotional, the domestic, as places where enslaved girls left traces of who they were, left traces of their lived experience. And so in my research, I engaged with a range of sources that are sometimes considered peripheral or secondary in traditional historiography. but they proved to be central when studying Black girlhood and resistance. So, for example, I use court transcripts and trial records, and these were fundamental, particularly cases involving allegations of poisoning and arson. And these cases often were marked the first, they only recorded, I'm sorry, the first um, name of the girl. There was no last name. And the trial itself became an archive of her personhood, even though, right, the trial attempted to strip her of her agency. Because in many of the trial transcripts, there's no testimony. And when the girl is referred to as the accused, she's paradoxically becomes legible, right? We start to see her, but we don't see her as a daughter. We don't see her as a friend or even a thinker. We see her as a legal threat. I use medical journals, especially those that were written by Southern white physicians. Um, and this was interesting because I have a chapter in my dissertation that talks about misattribution and toxicology and how really toxicology became a field because of poisonings that were taking place in the United States. And so these records, they were saturated with racist pseudoscience and gendered suspicion, but they also inadvertently captured something that was very important, right? In their attempt to pathologize the Black body, doctors often revealed what they feared the most. What they feared the most was the intelligence of Black women and Black girls, right? Because these females understood plants. They had a deep knowledge of plants, of poisons, and care. They knew that you could use a substance to heal somebody with just a little bit, but if you gave them even a pinch more, that would kill them. They had this intimate knowledge. And they feared their ability to maneuver within these domestic spaces. In one account, there was a physician who described an enslaved girl as a kitchen girl, and he said that she was too clever with the tinctures. And this was sort of a veiled acknowledgement of both her skill and the perceived danger that she posed. I also used runaway advertisements and newspaper articles that offered critical insight because many of the ads that were placed in the newspaper by enslavers who told everything, right, often included physical descriptions, what they were wearing, right, family connections, the type of punishments they received, and perceived behavioral traits. So a girl might be described as sassy or quiet or too bold. And these were all code words. They were code words for resistance, code words for small daily acts of refusal and courage. And so a girl then who refuses to answer to her name, or she was last seen in the company of her mother, whose cabin was one plantation over, she was asserting her presence. She was asserting that she had a family and she was asserting her autonomy in a system that worked to erase all three of those. Probate records were very instrumental and showed how enslaved girls were commodified and passed between households, and sometimes listed next to things like silverware and furniture. And so their names appear with monetary values that fluctuated with their age and their perceived usefulness. But even in the probate records, I had to read beneath the surface. A girl who was valued less after a disciplinary infraction, right? Or more after one of the siblings was sold. It tells a story about family separation and resilience hidden within financial ledgers. One of the cases in my dissertation that really highlights that is the story of Anne. You saw Anne's name on the title slide. She was 16. She lived in Williamson County, Tennessee, and she was owned in 1850 by the Marr family. Sally Perkins Marr was her owner. Initially, I thought it was her husband, Nicholas Marr, who was the owner, but he wasn't. It was his wife. She was the daughter, Sally was the daughter of a man named Nicholas Bigby Perkins, who was pretty popular, namely because he was noted as the individual who brought down and returned Aaron Burr, who I hope everyone remembers as the man who um, ultimately killed the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, after a duel that they had. And he was wealthy beyond measure. He had numerous properties in Williamson County, Tennessee. It was estimated that he owned upwards of 1,000 slaves throughout his lifetime. And while at many points I sort of thought that 1,000 was pushing it, once I was able to find his will, I was like, well, maybe he did, because he had 10 children and he willed to each of his children upwards of 40 slaves. And Anne was one of the enslaved people that Nicholas willed to his daughter. And Perkins sort of, just based on these fragments that I'm pulling, sort of viewed himself as a benevolent owner. And I got this from the will because of the way that he divided out the enslaved people. There were groups that he kept together, like full families, mother, father. He kept them together. And he was explicit in his will in saying these people cannot be separated from each other and they cannot be sold ever. But then there were others, and Anne falls into this category where he would describe them as, being sassy or whatever. And they were separated away from their parents. Anne was separated away from her mother. Her mother went to one of the brothers, and Anne ended up going to the youngest daughter, Sally. But then Anne poisons the infant baby. And it's at this point where I came up with the title for the chapter, She Became a Person. Uh, because what happened is that even though Sally was told in the will explicitly that she could never sell any of the enslaved people, after Anne's trial, and she had three, she was ultimately acquitted. Well, Sally doesn't want her anymore. And she petitions the county court in Williamson County to have her transported because she was, she just couldn't deal with her. She was a threat to the family. And so here we go. Anne starts out as property, not a person. She goes through three trials where she became a person, only to go back to not being a person because Sally is requesting for her to be transported out of the state. Other types of records that I looked at were church registers. Now, these were pretty rare, but they did offer some glimpses, for example, into the spiritual and communal dimensions of Black girlhood. In some cases, and not a lot, I was able to find baptismal records where they were available. And those baptismal records confirm kinship ties. And they also indicate moments when a girl was claimed by a spiritual community. And there was one instance, and this was not related at all to my dissertation, where there was a young girl, her name was Diana, or Dina, and she had been baptized on the same day as two older enslaved women, They were on the same plantation, but the record didn't say whether or not they were related. And so I was postulating that, maybe they shared some sort of lineage, or maybe they chose each other to be family, right? Either way, there was a spiritual kinship between these women and this young girl. And so these records then point to the internal worlds of enslaved girls and enslaved women. It also turns to the
Mm.
world of faith, belonging, and resistance through sacred rites. But these institutional records, they are not enough to fill the ethical and emotional dimensions that traditional archives lack. And so I had to turn to the Black community's memory. And the way that I did this was by engaging the WPA, the Progress Administration's slave narratives. And that's actually how I even got started on this topic of talking about resistance. I was looking through the Texas narratives, and I found a story of a woman who, when she was a young girl, the plantation mistress, who she described as being diabolical, had killed her infant sister. And, she always thought about that. It was always like at the front of her mind. And so eventually, she's given to the enslaver's daughter, who, the enslaved woman described as being nice and loving and all of these things. And there was this one instance where her former owner came to her daughter's home, and she started talking smack to um to this enslaved woman, who again had this deep memory of what the owner had done to her infant sister, and she knocked her out. And when she did that, the enslaved woman turned to her daughter, and her daughter was basically like, well, you should have kept your mouth closed. You got what you got. And so it was in that, seeing that Black women were standing up for themselves, right? And fighting back and resisting. And this is how I sort of got started on this topic. But these sources are often dismissed by formal historians as sort of anecdotal. An example of that is John Blassingame, very noted historian who refused to use the WPA narratives, partly because of who conducted the interviews. Most of the interviews were conducted by white men and white women. And so he just didn't use them. But I found them to be very rich sources of this intergenerational knowledge and cultural survival. And they are archives that in many ways are not archives of surveillance, but they're archives of care, right? And other types of archives of care are, for example, a handwritten family tree that's passed down across generations. That holds more information about a girl's life than an entire court transcript would. Or it could be a grandmother's story about the girl who stood up, and that can persist and preserve a memory more than an official record can, which often erases the memory. And so this brings me to that haunting phrase that I talked about earlier, where enslaved people became persons when they were punished. I found this in a 19th century abolitionist writing, where the abolitionist was critiquing slavery. And they noted that enslaved people were denied their personhood except in moments of criminal accusation. And for me, that was chilling, because it made me think about what happens today, right? Where, you know, Black and brown people experience the criminal justice system in wildly different ways than our white counterparts. And so that observation, though, reflects the logic of the archive. The archive documented Black girls not in their joy or their creativity, but in their transgressions. They became visible not in care, but in correction. Not when they were born, but when they disobeyed. And this inversion is what I was attempting to, and I'm still attempting to undo. And so the archival strategy I propose is not simply about preservation, it's about reorientation. It's about shifting the center of our gravity away from the state, the plantation, the courtroom, the jailhouse, the workhouse, and toward the kitchen, toward the prayer circle, the whispered conversations, and the quiet moments of defiance. It's about reading silence, not as an absence, but as a choice. It was a choice, it was a shield for many Black girls and Black women. And also, it was refusal. And it's about building archives with rather than about the communities that we study. So I want to build archives with rather than talk about the communities that I study. But in order to do that, there are several things that we have to do, right? We have to ask ourselves, who is the archive for? The archive is for elite white males. Who does the archive remember? It remembers elite whites. And who has the authority to interpret the contents of the archive? Well, anybody. And when we understand that, right, that anybody can interpret the archives, that's where I found that I could center Black girls. And so it wasn't simply adding new stories to old stories. The stories were already there, right? The stories presented the framework, but I was able to challenge the structure of the archive. I insisted that the lives of enslaved girls are not footnotes to someone else's history. They are at the center of their own lived experiences. And archival work doesn't belong only in elite institutions, right? Churches, families, and community organizations, especially Black-led institutions, have long preserved their histories through alternative and deeply meaningful modes, such as oral storytelling, handwritten church registers, family Bibles that are passed down across generations, and even the way that funeral programs are collected and treasured. These are archives of care. An example of this, I have two. My mother, she's a genealogist, and she collects funeral programs. She has binders of funeral programs, and they tell a story. And then there's my grandmother. When I was younger, my grandmother, along with some of my cousins, created a family recipe book. I still have the recipe book. It's not in its original bound format. It's like all torn apart because we used it. And my daughter, who is a chef, it was those recipes that she grew up learning how to cook, and it held our family's memories, right? And so these archives, right, it's part of my ongoing work around collaborating with different groups to build what I call participatory archives, archives that are not built for communities, they're built with communities. And these archives center local memory, they center the lived experience and intergenerational storytelling. They are about affirming that knowledge, which is not always found in official documents. It lives in people's attics, in kitchen drawers, and in the minds of our elders. Now, how do you do this, right? This sort of work includes training church and community members on, yes, Wheeler has a huge, and I'm a member of Wheeler Avenue Baptist Church, where the Reverend Dr. Marcus E. Cosby is my pastor. I have to throw that in. Um, It's about training church and community members in how to scan, how to tag, and describe materials using open-ended access tools like Omeka, and creating oral history projects that prioritize the Black voices of Black women, mothers, and grandmothers. These are the women, people that are often left out of public memory. And it's about encouraging families to preserve everyday items like letters and journals, photographs, especially when you write on those photographs that have writing on the back of them, right? It's about keeping homegoing and funeral programs, recipes that are passed down orally or through a cookbook, school report cards, and church bulletins. It's these documents, although they may seem small, they offer profound insight into everyday Black life, right? They document care work, cultural transmission, migration, joy, and resistance. And they reveal what the state archive often ignores. Um, sorry. So I have a question for the audience. Please feel free to drop your answer in the chat box. But who are the memory keepers in your family or in your community? And what materials or stories might already be a part of your archive, even if nobody has named it as an archive yet, right? It's still an archive. Now, this is important to me, right? Because when working with archival records about enslaved people, so Jason says in my family, it's the elderly members. Yeah. When working with archival records about enslaved Black girls and women, ethical interpretation is not just a methodological choice, right? It's a moral obligation. The stakes are very high because how we read, represent, and retell their stories can either reinscribe harm or begin to repair it. And so we have to then acknowledge violence without sensationalizing violence. We must recognize the brutal condition that these girls lived under, physical, emotional, and sexual violence that they were confronted with day in and day out. But we don't have to sensationalize it, right? We don't have to fluff up the story. I learned this very quickly in what I thought was my first chapter, and my advisor was like, "Now, Tamiko, I think that you're speculating a little bit too much." And I was like, "Okay, let me pull it back. Let me pull it back." Right? Because I didn't want to do harm to these girls, right? Um, so we don't have to sensationalize their experiences to make them legible or compelling, believable. Too often, historical narratives have fixated on suffering while ignoring Black girls and Black women's strategies of protection and survival. And so ethical interpretation asks us then, do we need to describe the act in graphic detail, right? Is the pain doing the explanatory work, or is the person? Instead of centering violence, we need to center the person who lived through and resisted and survived. We must write about the wound, but also we have to write about the girl who addressed the violence in silence. We also have to recognize absence as meaningful. Absence in the archive, we really shouldn't look at it as a void, because understanding that it's a consequence of structural violence, of voices deliberately being omitted or erased. And instead of seeing these gaps as shortcomings in our research, we need to treat them as meaningful spaces, places where the girl might have refused to speak. It was her choice. where she was denied recognition or where her story exists only in community memory. Sometimes what is not said reveals as much as what is said. And so I was asking myself, what might these girls have chosen not to reveal? And what does the silence protect or resist against? And I wanted to center girls' humanity, not just her punishment. We do that far too much. Enslaved girls often appear in archives only when they are being punished, tried for poisoning, listed in inventories, or described in runaway ads. But these moments, they did not define the totality of who they were, right? So I chose to resist the temptation to reduce them to the act of resistance alone. Instead, I asked questions like, who might she have loved? What did she live with? Who cared about her? Who did she care about? Who did she pray with? Who did she laugh with? Right? What knowledge did she carry with her? And so archival recovery is not just about documenting resistance, it's about restoring personhood. And my guiding question through all of this was, when I read a record of an enslaved girl's act and subsequent punishment, what would it mean if I narrated her life backward, from the moment of violence to the life that came before it? I have to tell you, this was hard. I spent many nights sitting at my desk, sitting at the kitchen table, arguing with the archives, arguing with people who had been long dead, and just grappling with why why was this done? Why was this level of violence in life and then in death done to these girls? And so that's a question that I pose to the audience. What does it look like to narrate someone's life backward, right? From the moment of violence to the life that came before it. So in conclusion, to recover the lives and resistance of enslaved Black girls and women, this is not just merely an academic exercise. It's an act of justice. It's an act of social justice. It demands that we interrogate not just what the archive holds, but what it excludes, what it distorts, and what it forgets. And so, to summarize the words of Marissa Fuentes, the archive is a site of racialized violence and gendered violence, but it's also a site of possibility. Through very intentional, ethical methodology, anyone that centers refusal, reclamation, and community can begin to restore personhood to Black girls and Black women who have been denied it in life and in the record. Thank you.
Excellent. Do we have questions? I know I have some. I have one that I wanted to ask. I put it in the chat if I can find it. You talk about the variety of sources that you used. Was it something that just happened organically? You're looking at one place and you go, maybe I'll look at medical records. Like, how did that, can you talk about that process?
Yeah, it was, I would say initially it was sort of like all over the place, because I was like, where do I look? Where do I look? Where do I look? Because I wasn't finding anything. And where I found a lot of information was actually in historical newspapers, right? So I talked about the WPA's slave narratives as one entry point. And one of my professors who I love dearly, Dr. Darrell Michael Scott, he was like, well, you should look at newspapers. There's a lot of good stuff in the newspapers. And I was like, okay. So I started looking through, and all these stories about poison just kept popping up. And it's really crazy, because my advisor, Dr. Nikki Taylor, her book was coming out. And when she did the book talk, I was like, what? Wait a minute. Uh, I'm writing about poison too. It was so weird. But she, really encouraged me to persist through this. And I just started when I would see something in the newspaper, if it talked about like a doctor, for example, examine a body or examine the food, I was like, okay, so where do I go from here? And I actually had to end up looking globally. For example, to understand toxicology, I had to look at Great Britain because there was a whole slew of poisonings that women were doing in Great Britain as well. And so looking at those records sort of gave me insight as to where to look over in the US, sorry,
Thank you.
um,
Hmm.
for records.
Thank
And I looked through census records. That's how I was able to find like some of the probate stuff. But then it wasn't a full record. And so I ended up having to go, for example, to Williamson County and their online records, to find much of the information. And I was looking at all of the antebellum South, which I now know was a very ambitious. And just pulling from different repositories. So
thank
yeah.
you. Jesse Esparza has a question.
Yes, Dr. Meek, thank you for your presentation. You mentioned the slave narratives. I'm
Mhm.
wondering if you can briefly talk about how it was that you sorted through those. I mean, did you use a finding aid or an index to do keyword searches of those kinds of things, or did you sort of comb through handwritten transcripts and handwritten transcripts? Can you talk a little bit about that process of combing through the
Sure.
WPA slave narratives?
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the first papers that I had to write was a very short paper for Dr. Darrell Michael Scott's class where he wanted us to use the WPA narratives. And I did use the finding aid. I knew I wanted to write about something in Texas. And I can't say that the finding aid was especially helpful. What was helpful was because they're digitized, right? Me just going in and doing a search for like women or violence or whatever. That's when I was able to find what I was looking for. But as I progressed through my research, so like over the course of like 2.5 years, it became easier because I knew, okay, so this is what you need to look for because, for example, sometimes poison is not spelled Poison, it's Poyson. And so different things like that. I was just picking up keywords from different sources that I was finding. And then I would go back to the WPA narratives and just do a search, you know, through the PDF form version of it, to find what I was looking for. But and it was really a combination of just reading. I didn't read all of them, but I read a lot of them, and using those search terms.
Roshi, did you have a question? Yes, go ahead.
Oh, yes, ma'am. First of all, thank you again, Dr. Meeks, for the presentation. My question was, my desire, because I love to write. I write different poems, short plays, children books, and different things like that. But I also have a big desire because I'm actually looking into programs and different certificates for both archaeology and genealogy. So I want to, look into that because about 5 years ago, maybe six, I started tracing my own family's
Mhm.
heritage, and I was blessed enough to get a lot of information from my paternal great grandmother who died in 2020 at the age of 99. I was able to get a lot of rich, yes, ma'am. I was able to get a lot of rich things from her because on both sides of my family, it's a lot of it's very ethnically rich. So there's a lot of Native American family members. There's a lot of white. Of course, Louisiana, you have French Creole, you have Cajun. I have family members from my mother's side who were from North and South Carolina. So there's a lot of family members that I found out they came from the Geechee Islands, Gullah Geechee Islands as well. And then I even found out, a while back that I have a lot of family. Actually, my great grandmother's sister, one of her sisters, lived in New Mexico, but I also traced back further where I have family members that actually came from Mexico from like many, many, many years ago. So my question to you is, with a family that is so big and blended, like 500 plus members on both sides, my question is, how would you basically go about, basing your research? How would you start, if I could word it right, because I have a lot of thoughts racing in my head, how would you basically start from the beginning? Because like I said, I already got a lot of that information, but I'm also looking into, traveling to Louisiana and, towns like New Bern, where my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, is buried and his family is based and stuff. How would you basically base your research and go about, digging deeper and actually finding more about, your family's history?
So that's a great question. My mom is a genealogist, and so I've been looking at this a long time, from literally like the time I was 6 years old, and she would, I don't want to say drag me because I don't know if she's on here, but take me to the archives and like looking through microfiche. But one of the, things that I can say that I sort of took from that is you have to have like a starting point, right? Just even if it's one person that you can go back and forth on. And I'm going to use one of the people from the dissertation, which is Nicholas Bigby Perkins. There was, I won't say a lot of information, but there was very useful information on him. And I would say if you're writing something that needs to be finished, don't do what I did, because my advisor kept getting on me to stop. Like, you found enough. But I kept, because things kept popping up. And so, for example, I found out that he was the person that brought down Aaron Burr. I found out that his family came from England, and there were portions of the family that had come from Russia, through England into the United States. There was a segment of the Perkins family that stayed in Virginia. There was a portion that went to New York. There was a portion in Tennessee. I found out that they were also connected to the Vanderbilts, like Gloria Vanderbilt and Anderson Cooper, right? But it was just this constant sort of digging and peeling back layers. And I don't know if your family is like this, but for example, with the Perkins family, it kind of made it hard. And why I kept persisting through it is because everybody had the same name. There were 100 Nicholas Perkins, right? There were 50 Sally Perkins. And I just wanted to know like how all of these people were connected. And so for me, it was taking that one person and then sort of peeling back the layers and then going and connecting people to that one person. And what I found out is that this like migration and this movement, it was, everybody was doing it. Even Sally, who Anne belonged to, she didn't just live in Tennessee. She kept moving from Tennessee to Alabama and back and forth. And so there were portions of the family that were, in Alabama that I found out about. So it's just, I don't know, you have to have this sort of dogged um desire, right, to really find, because it is intoxicating. It will consume your life. Um, yeah.
This is true. I wanted to know she mentioned Mexico. My great grandfather moved to what he thought was Mexico, and it was in 1841 when he came to Texas.
Oh, wow. It was.
Hello, he was trying to get out of the country. He migrated to West Texas from Virginia. He and his wife were described as mulatto farmers. So dude was not even trying to be in the United States, but Texas became Mexico. So there you have it. So just finding one, as I put in the chat, one of the essays that I recently wrote that was published on my family's history. I started with the death certificate of my great grandmother, just found its way to my email, and I just let her be the center. So it's just starting with one and adding to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do we have any more questions? Because I don't want to ask all the questions or comments. So can you talk about the patience that's required when you do history? We have to be some real patient. How did you pace yourself through this project?
Well, I don't want to tell everything because there are a lot of
Well,
things.
just the part the part that sounds good.
Um, I can't say that I'm really good at that because I don't know how to stop, right?
Mm,
But as I got closer to the end, I started because this was heavy work.
yeah.
Looking at these girls, thinking about what it was why they would even poison somebody, and then what was happening to them, like the types of punishments that they received. And so I did have to like really sort of practice self-care because I'm the type of person when I'm on a task, I will literally sit there from sun up to sundown and just go. And I have to say that you have to be patient because things are not just gonna come. Like there were months where I was like, okay, so why am I doing this? Like I can't find nothing. And then it's something, I don't know, somebody would pop in my head and be like, okay, so look here, right? But it was really because I was constantly thinking about these girls. They were always on my mind, um, that I was able to even get through it, right? And you have to be patient because things are archives are not always going to yield what you want them to yield, especially when you're talking about enslaved Black females.
I love the phrase you used, archives of care, because I think a lot of us we do kind of archive things. We don't think of it as archivy, but we have stuff that we hold on to,
Yeah,
you know. But the importance is recognizing that it is literally archival, so that when we pass on or whatever, it
yeah,
doesn't just go in the trash can. So we'll have some people who will talk specifically about donating papers to archives, because so much of history, especially African American history, so much of it is lost because folks didn't know that all those letters Mama had.
exactly, exactly.
They'll just toss them out. Mama has so much stuff, you know. But it's like, yeah, but that's history. So we have to educate the public in that way. But I love that phrase, archives of care, because I think we all have something that we hold on to,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Somebody that we know and love. I love that phrase. So maybe that's what we can say. We're going to establish archives of care when we
yeah,
talk to churches and people rather than archives.
definitely. I worked on a project with the University of Texas San Antonio and the Mellon Foundation. And in the last year, I was selected to put together a curriculum. And what my assignment is on is about preserving Black women's voices and thinking about Black women and how they enter conversations right around social justice because not everyone has been trained in the academy, right? And we have to be mindful of that. You don't have to be trained in the academy to have a voice. And so
Mhm.
this is what I want students to understand. And the project is centered around collecting these stories, doing oral interviews. And in doing that, I've worked extensively with Dr. Esparza, where we have train students how to do oral interviews, how to do those interviews with empathy and with care, right? Because it's needed not just for the person who's giving the interview, but also for the person who's conducting the interview,
Well,
right?
let me say this. Dr. Esparza is the president of the Texas Oral History Association, and Dr. Tamiko Meeks is the vice president of the Texas Oral History Association. So please connect with them if you're interested in doing oral history. I
And if
also
I may
wanted,
make a shameless plug, I'm sorry, we have a conference coming up the
oh,
1st
go right ahead.
of September, and it will be held at Baylor
Mhm.
University in Waco, which is the location of the Oral History of TOHA, Texas Oral History Association.
And two other points I wanted to make. So we have you mentioned the WPA narratives, which up to the establishment of the History Makers Archive was the largest
Yes,
oral
yes,
history archive of African Americans, 2,000 interviews. So Juliana Richardson, who's the founder of the History Makers Digital Archive, said she wanted to at least surpass that for the 20th century. And they have, at this point, they have 2,700 interviews and over 150,000 stories in that archive.
yeah. It's an
It's
amazing
wonderful.
archive. I was on the educational advisory board for them, and I use the archive a lot. I've introduced it to students. Every project that students have, it's a requirement. You have to, they have to use the archive, right? Because it's a excellent repository.
And
And
let me mention that they also, I just don't want to forget it, Dr. Meeks, they have a student ambassador program that you can
yeah,
apply for where they teach you, you'll be using the archive and of course, becoming an ambassador for the archive. So it's something to consider. You'll be able to get training as well.
yeah.
Any more questions? So,
Not a question, but I did want to just comment on something. I do like to pick up on what you said about death certificates because that actually gave me, some memories because I do remember I found out a lot of my paternal family's history because a lot of my mother's family there in Port Arthur, Beaumont, Louisiana, different things like that. But my paternal family, I know a little more. Like I said, when my great grandmother, when she passed, that's how I found out a lot about her family. Of course, through stories and how they got the land in Louisiana and different things like that. But through the family Bible that she had. It was she had two different ones. One was pristine and clean, and then I guess you had the legit one that was a little tattered and torn. And there was a lot of records and medical history, and that's how I found out about more about her father, who was my
mhm,
great grandfather, and how his family you know there's a weird thing with him, like he was like a mean and kind of surly man. So whenever they would ask him about, hey, where did you come from, he'd be so he wouldn't tell him anything. But through stories from my great grandmother and things like that, I found out that a lot of his family came from the Caribbeans because he was this jet black
mhm.
man with bright blue eyes. Because I found some pictures of him. So, different things like that. And I do agree with that. A lot of those things, like even with my maternal side, that's how I was able to find out a lot about my let me see, great grandmother who lived until the age of 114. She was a Native American woman.
Wow.
Yes,
Well,
ma'am.
let me say this about a death certificate. A death certificate has not only that they died, but what they died from,
Yeah.
Exactly,
where
exactly,
they died,
exactly. And that's how I found
who,
about,
yeah,
a
who
lot of
took
different
care of the
things.
body. I mean, who
Exactly,
was there to report that they were dead?
Yeah.
exactly,
And
Like
I
there's,
use
exactly.
a lot of death certificates
yeah.
in my dissertation.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, for me, when this certificate came, my great grandmother, she died at 57, and her death certificate came right before my 58th birthday. I was like, whoa,
Wow,
hold
wow.
up.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, I'm like, okay. So I was like, let me go ahead and write about her.
Yes,
Keep
exactly.
myself busy.
Exactly, exactly. And that's a weird thing that I found as well with death certificates is that it also, as I stated before, it leads to other things as well. But it
Yeah.
also, like I said, the family Bible has different things like that. But I know for my mother's family, like I said, I don't have access to things. That's why I'm trying to travel to Louisiana, where a lot of her mother's family is from, and then her father's family, who I never met. Her father died when she was like 13, but I was able to find his stuff very easy because he was a Navyman. So I was able to do that through a simple research, and that's how I found out about when he was born, the
Mhm.
year, month, different things like that. When he died, of course, from her stories, what he died from. So it's just a very interesting thing. And like I said about her great grandmother, they called her Mama. Right now, I'm trying to do research about her real name because she was a Native American woman. There's only two pictures of her that I found. It's one with her husband, who was a white gentleman, and then all of their sons who looked just completely white. This, the little formal photo where they're black and white. She's sitting on the couch with the husband and the sons behind, and then there's a second picture I found with her sitting in front of one of the old little houses that she lived on her property. She had
Mhm.
close to death by that point, because I believe my mother said that was taken when she was like 110, and she died at
Wow.
104. So it's just a very interesting thing, and it's like you said, finding that one person is very important, because I research sporadically, just like with my writing. I write
Mhm.
in the end and go back to the middle. So I found out a lot about my family from Africa. I found out that there's family members linked to the Igbo tribe, and then of course my name is Sandifer. That's from old England, as most people will say. So I'm doing research here and there. So I'm just trying to pace myself, but it is very interesting. Like I said,
So Denoshi, it sounds like you have a whole series there.
Yeah, for real.
You really do.
Alex
I have
Haley
a
part two.
I have a question, Dr. Meeks. So what is your next step? Where are you with your research? Where are you going?
So right now I am working on my manuscript for the book and thinking about additional chapters
Mhm.
that I want to add, and expanding some of the chapters that are already in place, specifically the chapter on misattribution, and then the chapter that talks about the legal aspect, right? Because I feel like we know this, that enslaved people were not people, and then the whole court system sort of transforms them. But that's something that I really want to like dig into, especially for women, Black women and Black girls, because this has persisted, right? And so the way even today that Black women are viewed and Black girls are viewed, we still want them in many ways to be quiet and to be silent and to not be seen. And then when something happens, there's this whole transformation that takes place, right? With with the legal justice system. And so yeah, that's what I'm working on right now. And then my daughter, um, who I could not have gotten through this PhD program without her, she has asked me to think about writing books that younger people can like
Yes,
really.
I was gonna, yeah.
And so I've started on a
Mhm.
project because she
That's
asked.
great. I'm glad she made that suggestion, because I was going to say that I could see this really being something that could appeal to a young audience to
Yeah.
write about slave girls. I just as you said, when I would go and see, I'm like, okay, so where do we go from here? All you see is this little
Uh-huh.
paragraph. Like this paragraph I bumped into regarding William Marsh Rice and an enslaved woman named Miranda. She was 30 though. And he put an ad out and he basically said, she may be lurking about town, you know. And
Lots
so,
of ads like that.
so, so what, and even in your discussion, what's clear is that if you had some of these repetitive things happen, there's some communication happening somewhere,
Oh yeah.
right?
Well, and one of the things that I didn't talk about, for example, with Charity, the young girl who was between 10 and 12, um, she was the reason why she poisons the family in the first place is because a young enslaved teen male was walking through the neighborhood and he heard her screaming. And so he comes back like a couple of days later and he asked her, he's like, why were you screaming like that? And she said, well, because the family, they were abusing her, they were beating her. And he tells her, he says, well, if you want to get rid of them, poison them. And he
Yeah.
gives her the money for her to go to the apothecary to buy the poison. So yes, there was, because this was, I guess, something that he had been thinking about in terms of the people that um owned him and who had apparently been committing acts of violence against him, right? Because again, there was no adult female that was in the historical record that lived in the house with Charity. So where did she get this idea at 10, 12 years old to poison someone? Right?
Yes.
So there was lots of communication that was going on.
Well, thank you, Dr. Meese. This has been wonderful. If there are no more questions, I'd like to make everyone aware that we will have another speaker next week, Dr. Quintard Taylor, who's the founding editor he's the founder and editor of blackpast.org. He's going to be with us next week. I know that, some of you in some of my classes, I definitely know that you have used blackpast.org. I experimented last semester with using it as a textbook,
Yes.
as a repository in that way, as the primary source for one of the classes that I taught. So I'm just honored that he's going to be with us next week. But I want to thank you. Okay. I was about to say, Brother Esparza, excuse me, I'm not in church.
No, yes, we are at church. No, I wanted to echo what you were saying, Dr. Kossie. I want to thank Dr. Meeks for the presentation and really for encouraging us to think in creative ways about the archives. I concur, and I think that the archives are overwhelmingly patriarchal and full of erasure. And I think that projects such as this dissertation and then the forthcoming book really sort of resist that. And I appreciate also the nod to really emphasizing and highlighting the community archive that is very much important and very much necessary given our current sort of political status, if you will, and the political temperature of our society. And then Dr. Kossie, too, I wanted to say thank you also for tonight's event. The Freedom at Your Fingertips speaker series is just one of the many treasures that you bring to our college and to our community. And so kudos to you and keep up the fabulous work.
Thank you. And I want to thank our Dean, Jane Perkins, who's been in the audience the entire time, and Dr. Elizabeth Brown Guillory, who's a distinguished professor of English, who was also our provost for a while. So we had quite a stellar audience here. And Dr. Ashley Preston joined us from Howard University as well.
Yeah. Dr. Preston was one of my professors, and I love her dearly.
Well, thank you all. We'll say good night.
Good night.
Thank you all.
Good night. Y'all take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
All of my students, thank you.